It's a pleasure to have Mark Anderson here. Mark's been a fixture at this university for a long time, and it's just really wonderful that early on when we launched the Sustainability Solutions Initiative, he and his colleagues basically formed something that came to be called the Sustainability Behavior Team, at least that's what I came to call them, and brought really an interesting mix of perspectives that I think you'll see today include all the kind of wonderful quantitative work that comes out of the social sciences with a deep attention to the philosophical issues about the sustainability problem. And nowhere does this get kind of the intersection of this more productively explored than in the work that they've been doing on this particular subject. This use of retrospective assessment, big part of sustainability is intergenerational equity, this idea that the future is we got to pay attention to their needs, but of course they're not at the table. And so how you get at that is a big part of the challenge. And interestingly enough, not just in the abstract, but even here we have conversations going on that Mark will talk about the future of Maine and how future stakeholders might view it, including an example he'll give of the possibility of a national park, right, where it's a little hard to know how the future will look at this. We certainly don't have any trouble seeing how many different views there are today. You only have to pick up the paper to see the rich breadth of perspectives. So I'm just going to say that I'm very grateful that Mark and his colleagues headed off on this journey, which began almost exactly 6 years ago. Right about now was the first indication we had that we were going to get this grant from NSF. And probably most of you don't know that exactly 2 months ago to the day, at least that part of the journey officially ended when our final report to NSF just got accepted. So Mark, by the way, if you don't know, this has been in phased retirement for a couple of years, and I think officially wraps things up, 2 weeks from now? But I'm pleased to say that I had coffee with him this morning, and I intend to do everything I can to make it hard for him to retire completely from this important work. So thank you, Mark, for being
here. Thank you, David. So really the ordering here is important. Caroline is the intellectual powerhouse behind this work, but she's serving cupcakes for her daughter's 6th birthday party right now.
Talk about intergenerational equity.
It was much more important than doing this. So to start with what David said, we talk about sustainability as this intergenerational concept, and it's one where if we go back at least to the Brundtland framework for it, we talk about the needs, and some people would argue wants, and that's the difference between needs and wants is a little fuzzy. Needs and wants of the present, needs and wants in the future, and then always some discussion about the biophysical aspects of this, although what that might mean is ambiguous in the way this is characterized. But nonetheless, for economists, this is a classic allocational problem. We have competing demands on the resources, the stuff of sustainability, whatever that may be. That's another part of the problem here, is trying to figure what that is. But clearly there's some sort of conflict. And I want to just focus on one piece of that, which is this piece here. If we think about the needs of the future or the wants of the future, and if we are going to acknowledge those as something which needs our attention, we'd have to know what those are. And for philosophers, this is a classic epistemological problem. How do you know what those needs might be? There's actually some problems thinking about the needs and wants of the present, which we'll get at, but the future is the focus of what we were looking at in this work. Now, economists traditionally have had an answer for this, and they've said if we want to understand the needs of the future, and in fact we do this in economics in the framework of benefit cost analysis, we say that's pretty simple. The needs of the future are like the needs of the present, and we simply have to project them into the future, and there might be more people in the future, so we can multiply present needs by some sort of factor and assume it carries that way in the future. And Solow is the classic representation of this. A famous speech he gave at Woods Hole in the early 90s. An economist looks at sustainability, or economist perspective on sustainability. Solow, Nobel Prize winning economist, and he characterizes this neoclassical economic argument very carefully as we don't know and cannot know what the needs of the future are, and therefore we need to behave like we aren't going to change. And this is what's inherent in economic analyses that we think about here. By the way, it's sort of a sidelight, but ecological economics used this speech by Solow to make a distinction between what now is known as weak sustainability versus strong sustainability, which has to do with capital, natural capital, and other forms of capital. So this talk, and it was a very informal talk, became a centerpiece of economists trying to work out this question of sustainability. So we have, again, this initial neoclassical economic perspective, needs and wants, which we can infer from people's preferences. They're ones that we can go into a marketplace and measure, that we can put dollar values on them because the market puts dollar values on them. Relatively easy to measure, and we've even spent millions and millions of dollars trying to figure out how to measure them when there aren't markets, so-called non-market valuation. But the assertion of the neoclassical model is that those needs are fixed, they're not context dependent, and they're stable over time, and therefore we can use them and project into the future. Increasingly, ecological and behavioral economists question those assumptions. And there's lots of, and I'll show you all the data in a second just to get at that questioning. And it's this questioning of those assumptions along with this assertion of sustainability science that stakeholders are important, that we need to engage stakeholders, that was the root of this work. If the future preferences, wants, and needs are not known, at the same time, those people in the future are clearly a major group of stakeholders for what we're doing in sustainability science. And so we need to somehow reconcile this. Just quickly to show you how big this problem is, there's some recent research from some psychologists they call the end of history illusion, where they asked people what they expect, in a number of different experiments, they asked people what they expect their wants and needs to be in 10 years from now. And then they had an analogous group of people who were 10 years older and asked them about their preferences from 10 years before. Invariably, younger people, whatever the ages are, younger people report that their preferences are unlikely to change in the next decade. And people 10 years older than them invariably report that their preferences changed a lot. And the idea of the end of history illusion is that most of us walk around thinking that we are going to be as we are largely into the future, and that we're not likely to change. Whereas when we look at the way people have changed, people change a lot. So there's this dichotomy between how people say they're going to change versus how they actually change in terms of some very fundamental aspects of taste and preferences. So the neoclassical assumption is probably wrong on two counts. It's wrong for us, thinking about ourselves. In other words, my preferences today are unlikely to be the same 10 years from now. And they're doubly wrong if we assume that my preferences today are like somebody else's 10 years from now. And so the question that we pose for ourselves is there a way we could get at some better understanding of the way people in the future might think about this? A couple of different ways have been proposed. One of the first was the idea of backcasting. And John Robinson at University of BC has written a lot about backcasting, where very simply, and Rob Lilliholm's work with Spencer Meyer used backcasting very effectively. And the idea of backcasting is you take current preferences and say, what would I like the future to look like? And then work backwards to the present, say, how would I get from the present to that desired future? And some very useful work in particularly participatory community-based activities in backcasting. And the alternative, and this is the one that I'm going to talk about today, that we proposed, was retrospective assessment. This came out of work that was done in the 1970s, which was called retrospective technology assessment, where people who were doing technology assessment said, what if we put ourselves in the past and tried to assess new technologies as they might progress in the future? Would we have gotten that correct? Or to shift the time frame, let's put ourselves in the present and say, what would we have wanted to know about a technology in the past? And how might we have used that for a more reasonable or desirable public policy outcome? And most recently, historians have gotten interested in this. There's a book that's made a pretty big splash in the history community earlier this year called The History Manifesto, which was a call for changing the way historians engaged around public policy. Not quite the same thing that we're talking about here, but in the same vein of using history to think about public policy. So I want to talk about retrospective assessment because that's what we did. We proposed this idea in an article that came out of SSI in Ecological Economics a couple of years ago. And we said, what we really need to think about are people in the future as stakeholders in the activities that we do today. And as such, there are two things the future might respond to. Well, maybe there's three. We didn't talk about indifference, but people in the future might even might regret or be grateful for the things that we do today. And therefore, we can use that to think about, if we're in the future, how might we respond to the things that we do today? And so it's this sort of time shift that we used, that we suggested was a way of getting at a better understanding of the preferences of the future. The problem was, just because you get an article accepted doesn't mean there's anything of value to it, and it was a nice idea, but no one had ever proven that it did anything. There was no empirical evidence. So we said, let's use SSI money and do some development of empirical evidence to see if this actually works. And we had a pretty simple hypothesis. We used Baxter State Park and the proposed Maine Woods National Park as the model here. And we said, we have this fundamental hypothesis that people will think positively about Baxter State Park and Percival Baxter, and that positive thinking about that will change the way they think about Roxanne Quimby and a proposal to donate money to create a national park. It was a pretty simple hypothesis and not too hard to test. Essentially, thinking about people in the future as stakeholders for the proposal for Maine Woods National Park, just as we are stakeholders for Percival Baxter's establishment of Baxter State Park. So we took the park idea and basically said, can we get some information about how asking people to think about Baxter changes or doesn't change how they think about the Maine Woods National Park and the Roxanne Quimby test. A cognitively challenging survey. So this was done as a mail survey, and this probably reduced the response rate. And our sample, this is a Maine population sample, it's slightly older and slightly more educated than the state population. And probably it's a result of the people who got to this point and said, I'm not going to answer that. But this is the way we did this. We described the Baxter experience rather briefly. We used Neil Roll's book about Baxter, which is just superb in telling this story. And then we gave people 4 options with a Likert scale. The first option was, I'm grateful for Governor Baxter for having done this. I wish he had established a national park. I wish he had given to the federal government to establish a national park. I wish he had given to the federal government to establish a national forest. Or I wish he hadn't bought the land and left it in private hands. So that was the Baxter story and the responses we gave. We used the Quimby proposal at the time to do a similar thing, a brief description of the idea, and analogous responses with Likert scales. I'm grateful for Roxy and Quimby for having made the offer to establish a national park. I wish he had made the offer to the state and had this be a state park. I wish he'd offered it to the federal government as a national forest, or I wish he had left the land in private ownership. The beauty of the experiment is the story, the historical story is close to being analogous. The only difference is she was an entrepreneur and he was a politician. But these were private monies, lands purchased in free market transactions. The Quimby offer is a smaller magnitude in terms of acreage, and it's a one-time offer, whereas Baxter did this in 22 or 25 different parcels. It was done over a period of time, but very similar kind of activity. So we had a simple experimental design here. The control was to show the Quimby questions only to half the respondents, and the treatment was to show the Baxter story first and the Quimby story second. So it was a pretty simple experiment. And the hypothesis was that first of all, a couple of hypotheses that worked in this experiment didn't work in another experiment we did in the same survey. First of all, we were assuming that people were going to react positively to the Baxter story, that people were grateful for this. If that hadn't been the case, the whole design would have fallen apart, and lo and behold, it did. Actually surprised us. 89% of the respondents were grateful for Baxter for having done this. And the logic was that this would make them, because this high sense of great gratitude would make them respond more positively to the Quimby proposal. So not the control over there, not surprisingly, 30% of the respondents in the control group were grateful, 29% wish she had made the offer for a state park, 14% for a national forest, and 25% wished that she had just left the land in production, in private production, and not purchased it. So our hypothesis was that response number 1 would increase, and that response number 4 would decrease, and we were surprised. And we didn't see this coming. We were right about number 4, and these are different, statistically significant differences. People did dramatically change, or the treatment dramatically changed response number 4. It goes from 25 to 15% thinking they wished the land had been left in private ownership. No change in the response to the national park, but a dramatic increase in those who thought that the offer should have been for a state park. So it wasn't the tenor of the response that mattered. It was the specific content. People were happy about Baxter having given the park to the state and not to the federal government, which was a big controversy at the time that the park was established. The film, this is great sort of modern popular cultural piece to this, In the movie The Aviator, there's a villain who's a senator from Maine, Owen Brewster, played by Alan Alda, and he's this sort of nasty, conniving politician. And Owen Brewster was, in fact, not just a film character, he was actually a senator from the state of Maine at this time, and he was working very hard to establish a national park with Katahdin as the center. And Baxter fought this vehemently, and the telling by Rold, at least, is that Baxter fought this because he had been to the parks out west and felt the Park Service was not a very good steward of the natural environment. This was where, there were bear shows and, feedings of wildlife and building of big hotels and such, paved roads, all of which Baxter didn't want for the area. So it's a big fight in Maine between proponents at that time of the park or the area around Katahdin as either a national park or a state park, and Baxter essentially uses his money to win the argument, if you will. So what people responded to was not that Baxter was good, therefore Roxanne Quimby is good, is that the idea, at least you can infer, that the idea that a park was a state park, and maybe this is distrust of the federal government. I'm not sure what that is, but it's a pretty obvious result. So the result is context does matter, but it matters maybe in ways that are a little bit surprising. We had a similar experiment that we did on energy policy, where this was supposed to be the positive policy impact, changing people to think more positively about an analogous proposal. We had another experiment designed similarly, but it was a negative experiment where we assumed wrongly that people would have a negative view of corn ethanol subsidies, which would change the way they thought about wind power development. But it turns out that people didn't think as negatively about corn ethanol subsidies as we did. And that sort of made the experiment. It does, the story, the first part, it does, telling the corn ethanol story does change the way people respond to wind power development, but in ways that aren't quite as clear and neat as this one here. But we now can assert with a little bit of empirical evidence that there is this effect, that preferences for policies are context dependent, that we don't simply have to assume that preferences in the future are going to be the way they are today, which is the one outcome that we know is not the case. So the irony is we're using in our analyses the one outcome that we are sure will not hold, but now we have some evidence that we can think perhaps more creatively about future as stakeholders, but it's hard to do, and it's hard to do well. And since this came about, ecological economics took this too, so this is just out. In fact, Back to the Future, this is just out in June, so even though we're not there yet, go figure. And of course, thanks to EPSCoR, because all of this was funded through SSI. So this is why you're supposed to not like corn ethanol, but it didn't work out that way. At least by one telling of the story right, the decline in monarch butterfly populations is largely due to corn ethanol subsidies. So, questions? Ivan.
So, can you say something about, for a non-social scientist, as to how these are implemented, the time frames that matter? So they get a survey, they respond. If we just got a big storm and the federal government came to the rescue versus federal government just handed down some $100,000 tax bucks, whatever it is. How much do you know about the time frame of impact and the context of current events that influence this kind of research?
Well, we certainly know that it's going to,
Right.
and we could look at the for example, the Pew data on climate change, I think they've been asking longer than anybody else about how people think about what's causing climate change or whether it's happening or not. And we know those numbers change over time, and they change in the way the question is asked. When different people ask it differently. The Gallup responses are different than the Pew responses. So that's, I think that's part of the story, is to use a business frame for this. In a sense, this is subversive or creative destruction research, in the sense that there's a lot of people running around, including the US EPA and other federal agencies, that are telling clients that benefit cost analysis is integral to the way we should be doing this kind of work. And in fact, the EPA website on this has a whole section called Benefit Cost Analysis and Sustainability, or something like that. And basically, this is more evidence that you should be very suspect of making your decisions using benefit cost analysis because of this context dependency, including these current events that you're talking about. So that's not really helpful. It doesn't say what you should be doing, but it does say what you shouldn't do. You should be very cautious about
And
it.
so it brings to mind, sort of what's the amplitude and frequency of that short-term impact in how you would use this insight for decision-making.
That's right. Right. And as we discovered, we spent a lot of time crafting the experiment and thinking about this, and we were totally surprised by the response that we got, in the sense that we were thinking of these as positive negative frames, and it turned out that the specifics were much more important of the story.
So I have a few things. First, I'm a little surprised that you didn't anticipate that result. Of course, hindsight. But, Dave Judd gave a talk here years ago that basically was about views of Mainers, particularly from that part of the world and the history of that part of Maine, basically saying, they will never want the federal government to have something there. So, you could have suggested that what they would like about the Baxter Park was the state receiving it. But that wasn't on your mind?
Right, and because we were reacting to the part of the story which was the way in which Baxter was reviled for what he did. And so there was a significant effort from Great Northern Paper, among others, spent a lot of resources fighting Baxter and trying to make it difficult for him to even purchase the land. And one of the things that Baxter very strategically did, and he talked about this, was he made the gift in these 22 or 25 parcels, and he said that part of the reason he did that is he needed to do that to placate some landowners. So the parts of the park where you can hunt, because even though he was an anti-vivisectionist, that you could hunt there because he couldn't get them to sell the land to him unless he promised that hunting would still be allowed there. So in the southern, I don't remember which southern corner of the park you can hunt, but other parts of the park. But the other thing that Baxter said was, I gave the land in these different parcels because I wanted there to be this record over and over again where the legislature and the governor accepted the gifts, and that it was multiple legislatures and multiple governors to sort of inure against the potential backlash in the future, which is also why he sets up the park. The park may not be run through the Bureau of Parks. It has this separate authority, and he also perceived that was another insulation from local politics. So we clearly, right, we weren't as smart as we should have been in picking that. Right. It's in retrospect, it's an obvious outcome.
So and the second part of this is another, maybe I probably don't understand enough of how the history and how people look at it, but there's a kind, it feels like there could be an irony that people like the idea that Baxter gave it to the state and not the federal government, because aren't there some ways in which the Baxter's vision for the park, and what you said about his experience in the West is consistent with that. It's kind of like he wanted less, I mean, obviously national parks aren't like national forests in terms of multiple use, but they're probably more like, there's a lot of things you can't do in Baxter Park, except I don't quite know those little places where you can hunt and all, that you could do in a national park.
Right, exactly.
Right?
And that
so,
was, and
so
then,
is there any, do you have any sense of how different kind of stakeholders, whether it's easy for them to reconcile all that? In other words, it's,
I suspect most people don't understand that. For example, in the upper northwest corner, you've got that scientific forestry management area as well, which seems different, right? And I don't know the story behind that, whether that was to placate an owner. But I think in a sense he was doing this, he was learning by doing when he did it. And I suspect most people don't fully know the story. And I'm my own understanding of this relies on Neil Roll's version. I'm sure there are other versions. Yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask for some clarification. So I thought Baxter State Park was not actually state-owned land.
It is state-owned
It is
land.
state-owned land.
It is.
But it's not managed by the state?
It's managed by the state, but it's not managed by the Bureau, what we would now call Bureau of Parks and Land, is that what they still call it? And that's because Baxter didn't trust governors and didn't trust appointed, no, that's not right. He didn't like who had been running state parks at that point. And so he set up the Baxter State Park Authority, which is the Attorney General, Commissioner of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and I'm trying to remember what the third one. There's a third. They end up all being the officials in the state. Although, as we see with the fights between the governor and the attorney general right now, he had some wisdom in thinking that the attorney general might be a buffer against the current political flows. But then also in each of these is a deed with specifics. With each of these 22 or 25 gifts, there is a deed that he transfers to the state, and it has specific language in it. Forever Wild is in most of those deeds. It's not in all of them. And so the state is clearly the owner, but it's the Baxter State Park Authority is this unusual creature in Maine government. Yeah.
Mark, in your survey, I was thinking about the question that you asked. I was thinking I had answered it. But clearly there's sort of, I guess we'll call it a psychological perspective on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, I guess. Is the future going to be better or worse than we are now? Is there any way when you do these surveys, or you did try to control? So someone might say, well, that's a good idea, but you know what? We're doomed. Doesn't matter. Whatever we do today, we're not going to be able to stop this.
Yeah, and
Or tomorrow's going to be awesome, and this is a great idea.
Sure. That would be, actually Shannon McCoy has some questions in the survey that might get at some of that. So we haven't looked at that piece of it yet, but certainly that matters. One of the principles we know out of behavioral economics now that's really very clear, which has something to do with this, which is something we call the status quo bias. So the easiest way to see this is very simple experiments which economists do in classrooms all the time now to teach students about status quo bias, is you give everybody $1 and then you have a coffee mug that you try to auction off, and Then you have a different group of students where you give everyone a coffee mug and you try to buy it back. And students invariably, not just students, we know this now about humans, or at least Americans in general, when you actually own something, what you're willing to sell it for is almost always higher than what you're willing to pay for it when you don't own it. And in theory, it ought to be the same, right? There's a whole literature now in behavioral economics around this idea of status quo bias. And we can see some of that here. Clearly, Baxter did it, the park's been there. Who the hell's Baxter? I don't know. But for as long as I've been alive, the park's been there, and I went there once. And so it is part of the status quo. So humans are sticky in terms of their preferences, and things as they are, we have a preference for compared to change, which is another way or another wrinkle on this idea of being optimistic or pessimistic. Yes, my wife is an environmental pessimist, and she thinks that she doesn't call it tipping points, but she thinks we're well past the tipping point, and she occasionally invokes the desirability of the onset of the glaciers, because at least it'll solve the problem here. I remind her it doesn't go to Florida, likely. So the other reaction, if you're not interested in the onset of the next glaciation, the other response is what I call the party on response. Right? So might as well don't need to worry about this because we're past the tipping point. So I might as well enjoy as much of it as I can for as long as I can. Right? So that's the kind of response you get. It helps with the depressing parts of that.
Well,
How might work like this translate into policy, where hard numbers are often desired, and without a more nuanced view, it's often difficult to make an actual policy decision, which I think is part of the draw of that classical model.
Sure, we got numbers. We can add them up. We can discount them. We can talk about discount rates. We can do all that good stuff. And I can tell you this one is a bigger number than that one. And policymakers can tell the difference in terms of magnitude of numbers. So it's very powerful. Right? So I think the first policy application is to introduce, as Ivan expressed it, a caution about believing those. But then it says, okay, we spent a lot of resources trying to measure current preferences and projecting them into the future. In other words, just assuming all we have to do is multiply by some sort of population growth factor and then discount. What this says is we could spend a lot more money trying to think about how we perceive past policy decisions to then help us then say, okay, if I think this about that, and I probably wouldn't have thought that way then, how will these people think about what we're doing today? And so you could do more than one experiment. You could do lots of experiments and try to understand what those drivers are, and then that would give you the ability to understand how we would call that temporal reliability. Kevin Boyle and others that I was a small part of years ago looked at temporal reliability of contingent valuation to do exactly the same thing as if you ask if you do a contingent valuation study today and we do it again in a year from now, do you get the same responses? In that case, we did. This 10-year, this end of history illusion suggests we get different responses. So I guess the first step is a cautionary tale. But there's such a momentum behind this measurement now in the policy realm that it's hard to think about how it might stop.
What?
Using market metrics, benefit cost analysis, right? it's so compelling.
Oh, so concrete.
It is, right. And then for stuff you can't measure, you say, whatever, you can't measure it.
Right.
Or,
Very
right,
good.
or sometimes, people say, well, we've accounted for that stuff over here, somehow, sort of. Yeah. So this is, let's be a little more nuanced about this. But you're right, this is more destructive than it is constructive. Which is what curmudgeons do.
Thank you.
You're welcome, thank you.